The Russell Tribunal on Palestine is happening in Brussels this week, and what they're doing is assessing war crimes during the recent Israeli offensive Operation Protective Edge in Gaza. And I have some of the testimony here. I want to read you some accounts from objective, reliable sources on the ground. So first, let's go to Ivan Karakashian. Don't make a Kim K joke. This guy is an advocacy unit coordinator at Defense for Children International. So we're talking about a charity group here. This is somebody who belongs to a charity who was on the ground during the fighting, and he explains, quote, "A 16-year-old boy was stripped naked and used as a human shield by Israel for 5 days. He was denied food, water, and sleep, and mentally and physically abused, including lashed with a wire across his back. The Israeli army stopped a family car near a West Bank protest over Gaza, positioned their weapons in the windows of back doors where toddlers were sitting, and began to fire on the protest. This is not an isolated incident." So what he's saying right there is really mind-blowing to people in the United States of America, because whenever you hear talk about human shields, it's always people saying, well, Hamas is using human shields, Hamas is using human shields, Hamas is using human shields. And I'm sure in some circumstances they absolutely do. But usually the argument that's given is, Hamas is firing rockets from areas that have majority civilians. But all of Gaza has majority civilians. So what do you want them to do? Go out in the middle of the desert and fire from there, where they're an open target? And is that what Israel would do if they were in Hamas's shoes? Because I doubt that. Okay. So there's arguments against the Palestinians that they use human shields. But what we're talking about here is a charity worker who's on the ground, who has no stake in this in terms of, personally for one side or the other. And he's saying, this is what I saw. I saw Israeli soldiers literally use human shields to prevent Palestinians from attacking them. Next is Max Blumenthal. This guy is an American journalist. He says, quote, "We found one of 89 families completely liquidated during Operation Protective Edge, so badly burned and destroyed they had to be buried in a mass grave by a bulldozer, evoking memories of the darkest times in European history. On the outskirts of Rafah, I heard testimony from 19-year-old Mohammed Abu Saeed of how Israeli soldiers stripped him naked and sniped at neighbors, then set the dogs on him in between shooting rounds. In Kuza, a man left a group of resistance fighters in his home. He returned to find their throats had been cut, their bodies piled in a corner and burnt with grenades. A clear pattern of executions has been established. Israeli soldiers gather civilians in an open area, asks if anyone speaks Hebrew. When people step forward, they shoot them dead. 4 brothers of one man were taken into the garden and shot dead. One of them was mentally disabled and had little idea he was being killed." Woo! That's heavy and scary. We also have a guy named Martin Lahuni. This is a German journalist. He says, quote, "More than 90% of Gaza's agricultural output was destroyed by Israel over the summer. Almost all farms were destroyed. Israel destroyed 220 factories in Gaza. This constitutes around 70% of Gaza's industrial output gone. There was no military justification for the destruction of these factories. I stayed in Gaza for 1 month in a house with 72 Palestinian civilians, 60 of whom had been displaced. It was overcrowded. Tap water wasn't working anymore. We had to buy fuel. We had to bake our own bread, as none was available in shops. 220 factories were completely destroyed during the 7 weeks of Israel's Operation Protective Edge. Israel had succeeded in turning a functional economy in Gaza into a third world territory in just 8 years. Through the blockade and 4 large-scale military assaults, Israel is not only attacking systematically civilians in their homes, but systematically destroying the economy of Gaza to make people dependent on aid. So what are we to take away from this? Well, in Operation Protective Edge, over 2,000 people were killed in Gaza. 80% civilians. Over 500 children. There were reports of multiple UN schools being attacked, multiple hospitals being attacked. These things, under no circumstances, if anybody does them, are they debatable to rational people, to people who give a shit about human decency at all. So what do we do in response to this? Well, number one, if I'm the U.S., I cut off my over $1 billion in aid to Israel because they don't need it. And guess what? They'll shrug it off because they're going to be just fine without it, okay? But that's what I do, to send a message to the world that we're not on board with insane offensives that end up killing over 80% civilians. That's never excusable. 10% is inexcusable. If you're over 80, you just don't give a fuck about the civilian deaths. Okay, so that's number one. You cut off the aid, but then you also boycott Israel on a personal level, and most importantly, you sanction them. The exact same thing that we did to apartheid South Africa, which made them shape up, okay, when international sanctions came on them and the movements, the peaceful movements inside the country got bigger and bigger and bigger, finally they caved. Well, what's our goal? We force Israel's hand until they have to accept at least the 1967 borders. And also, of course, Palestine should become its own state. It should get UN recognition. Okay, and they should be there should be a two-state solution, totally equal sides, at least 1967 borders. I would prefer the 1947 borders, but that's seeming less and less even theoretically possible at this point, which is depressing. But you need to sanction them and put pressure on them to force them to the table and to stop them from doing insane acts of barbarity like this.